So, welcome back to Use It or Lose It, the show where we break conservation open and look at what's really inside, especially as we head towards COP20 in Uzbekistan. Today, we're going fishing, literally and politically. Our guest is someone who has spent 4 decades on the water, not in boardrooms, not in NGO webinars, and not behind screens. I'm talking about Jim Lovgren, one of the most outspoken commercial fishermen in the United States, and a man who's been fighting policy battles long before most policymakers even learned how to spell ecosystem based management. Jim has worked with the Fisherman's Dock Cooperative in New Jersey, the Center for Sustainable Fisheries, Mid Atlantic Fishery Management Council Advisory, and countless policy tables where bad decisions hurt real communities. Today, he joins us to talk about what policymakers often miss. The fact that fish don't read NGO press releases, the fact that fisheries collapse when politics replaces science, and how bans at CITES can destroy livelihoods faster than any storm on the Atlantic. Jim, welcome to Use It or Lose It.
Well, good morning and good evening to you, since we're around the world.
So it's an absolute pleasure to have you, Jim. We're really excited about having you on this podcast, and today we're going to speak a lot about fisheries, in particular, the fact that COP20 is right around the corner, and brief breakdown of CITES itself and how it's changed over the years. Now, I want to start with the first segment, which I've labeled as the view from the deck, in which I'd like you to take us back, 40 plus years on the ocean. You've literally seen fisheries rise, fall, and recover. What did the early days of your career teach you about how fish populations actually behave compared to how policymakers imagine that they behave?
Well, I can go back before the Magnuson Act in 1976 was passed. I started fishing in full time in 1974, and a couple of summers before that. Actually, in a fishery that doesn't exist, one of the first casualties of the Magnuson Act in fisheries management was a lobster trawl fishery that we had in the Hudson Canyon. And we were working in 1,000 feet of water, trawling for lobsters. Everybody thinks that you catch them all in pots. Well, there was enough lobsters out there that we were catching them with nets. And you could spend 3-4 days out there and come in with 3 or 4 thousand pounds of lobsters, and some of these lobsters were over 20 pounds, even 25 pounders. They were huge because nobody ever fished that bottom before. And that fishery got shut down by lobstermen from New England, actually potters, who with the Magnuson Act passage decided that they wanted to expand their range down into the southern waters of the Hudson Canyon, which is near, it's the southern end of the lobster's habitat here, the American lobster there. And we basically, this company decided that I've heard that they had a shareholder or a partial owner who was a politician, whether that was a state assemblyman or a congressman or whatever it was, but they ended up getting legislation passed that didn't allow you to trawl within a certain amount of distance to the lobster pots. And also, if they happen to catch you in their lobster pots, you'd be responsible for paying them. And our game back then was relying on one company that was in Point Pleasant there. He had a lobster fleet that worked year round. We were only doing it half of the season there. And that's a different story there because our main fishery was white and the silver hake. But in the summertime, we would fish for lobster because there wasn't a lot else to do. And we got shut down when this lobster shanty, when his fleet, he sold them because he could get lobsters cheaper out of Canada than paying for the maintenance of a boat and crew and so forth. It's just easier to import them. When he lost his fleet, when we went out there one summer to go fishing again, the place was plastered with lobster pots, and you couldn't tow a net anywhere near there. So that was actually the first casualty of fishery management from the Magnuson Act. A few years later, they created an ITQ fishery for surf clams. Okay, and that was the first Mid Atlantic Fishery Management Council plan, and that literally took a fleet of 200 boats and turned it into 50 or 60, owned by pretty much three or four companies. And that's what ITQs do. They consolidate the industry into a bunch of haves and have-nots, and if you're a have-not, you're out of business, and that's what happened to a lot of them. Fortunately, at that time, some of those people were able to get into other fisheries because they hadn't created limited access permits in these other fisheries yet. So yeah, we've been through it all there. In the case of white in there, that was this Fisherman Stock Cooperative, and I just finished writing a book about it. It's under review with Rutgers University Press right now. I'm trying to wrote a book that actually could be used as a college textbook because it deals with one of the most successful seafood cooperatives in the world. For 70 years, over 70 years, 1953. And it's an oddball, seafood cooperatives. Everybody thinks of agricultural cooperatives, but in 1934, I believe it was, they passed this legislation that allowed for the creation of seafood cooperatives in our country. So we were not one of the first, but we're a survivor, and that's very few. I probably the only existing co-ops that's older than ours is in Alaska, and that's the most successful co-op in the world. It's $100 million operation plus anyway. But our fishery developed, and we were working in the mud hole, which is located about 15 miles off of northern New Jersey. And our fishery there was whiting. And at one point, for about 10 years, we were the lead in white import on the East Coast. So that changed by fishery management, partly, probably a pretty good part of it, but also warming waters. Okay, we noticed the effect. Our landings throughout the 80s stayed the same. Okay, but we ended up by 1990, we weren't fishing in the mud hole 15 miles away. We had to catch those fish 70 miles away in the Hudson Canyon because the population was moving to the east back into the cooler water because waters were warming up. And they have, whether, um, global warming, that's a controversial issue there. Climates change, in this case, global warming, waters were warming, at least on the east coast of the U.S. anyway. Um, but yeah, so we ended up by 2000, our whiting fishery was totally gone. But one of the things that happened around 1990, the early 90s, is that the New England Council opened up a new fishery on the Cultivator Shoal in Georges Banks, and that was a relief valve for the New England fleet, the groundfish fleet, their cod, haddock, and flounders, and so forth, because those stocks were overfished. So they had to try and get these boats something else to do. So we had a self-regulated fishery here in New Jersey. We work with Long Island fishermen, and we put voluntary trip limits on our boats, and we worked basically 5 days a week. You had a 10,000 pound trip limit. Sometimes you never caught that, but that was the most you could catch. And the idea was to limit the supply into the market because nobody wants to catch fish and come back with no value. You killed a lot of fish. I mean, people eat, but and somebody made a profit, but it wasn't us. The people that make the most profit seem to be the middlemen. But anyway, that created what is a intercept fishery, because those fish that they were catching in the summertime were the fish that we would catch in the wintertime, and they weren't making it back to New Jersey. By 2000, our whiting fishery was pretty much gone. We were catching less than 1 million or 500,000 pounds a year, and that was down from 7, 8 New Jersey landings, like over 10 million for a few years. So that was a lot of fish, and they disappeared, gone with the wind. Oh yeah, there's been a lot of management things here.
Yeah, it sounds it sounds. I'm glad you've given us a very brief summary of the history, because a lot of this history actually goes unnoticed. Especially when it comes to media communications and getting word out to the masses. More often than not, a certain agenda is formed, and the masses end up believing that for the next decade or not. What I picked up on from what you just explained is that eventually it sounds like fisheries reached a point perhaps where fishermen, who are people who literally spend their lives in the water, started to get treated as villains instead of partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Call it villainization there. The NGOs, and they were started out being funded by the Pew. Well, it wasn't. It was Pew Charitable Trust at that time, and they decided around 1990, after the Exxon Valdez spill and all of the bad publicity they were getting, that they needed a new villain. So they decided that fishermen were overfishing. And the real reason they wanted to do this and villainize us was to get us off the water, because in the early 80s, Congress had passed a bill banning offshore oil exploration or drilling on the east coast of the United States. And ever since that happened, they were trying to figure out ways to be able to do that. Now, the oil reserves off the East Coast aren't very big. They estimated a 60-day supply of oil at that point. That has probably been substantially increased now with the discovery of the Marcellus shale deposits in Pennsylvania and New York State, okay, and the ability to frack and convert shale into oil. Now, those deposits lead all the way out to the Hudson Canyon. And the best of it is actually in right to the west of the Hudson Canyon, about 20 miles where they hit the most, and that's coincidentally where a number of major wind companies slash oil companies bid serious money to be able to drill in these areas. Well, not to drill. I'm sorry, they're for windmill sites. Okay, but they happen to be located right over these major oil reserves. And these are Orsted was one of them, one from France, a number of anyway. They paid like 5 times more than anybody expected them to pay for the leases in these particular areas. A couple of years, well, a year later, they would lease off of North Carolina, similar size, and it was like $100 million for the lease, as opposed to 5 and 600 million they paid for these other ones. And that's because there was no oil reserves under there. So it's interesting there, but the villainization aspect, though, it's really bad. It got into where they created a thing. Let me see here. The NGOs, okay, got involved in fishery management. So I'm on the Mid Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and all of a sudden there, you got these people there that are considered stakeholders. The council was set up, and the U.S. fishery management system, the regional management councils, it's a very progressive creation. They really do a really good job of management, provided the proper science, which is another issue we can get into. But they started considering environmentalists as the stakeholders. These councils were supposed to be set up with state fisheries directors, a commercial representative, and a recreational industry representative. We have a lot of recreational industry in the U.S. East Coast and throughout the whole country. It's an important segment of the fishing industry. And all of a sudden, they decided that we needed environmentalists on there because they were stakeholders. And the only stake that they held was the one where they were driving through our hearts, because they didn't want us using nets. They didn't want to catching anything. Like they want to turn the ocean into a petting zoo. But when you get down to who was funding those NGOs, you'd come up with the name Pew Charitable Trust. And they started branching off and feeding money to other groups and so forth. And we became villains. They made a villain out of us. And it's a sad state of affair, but that's the fact of it.
But when I had formed this question that I had asked you, and I had particularly used the word villain, I was I was assuming at that point that am I right about using this word, but it's really unfortunate that that is what the truth is. I mean, that is the reality. and and I understand from your explanation about this that there have been many sides that have come in and played the game, but it has all resulted in the villainization of the fisherman. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you've also written a lot extensively about how US fisheries policy has been sort of captured by emotional narratives and political lobbying and poorly sort of interpreted science. Aren't these things, all three, emotional narratives, political lobbying, and poorly interpreted science, aren't all of these things a byproduct of what the NGOs have been presenting? I mean, where really has the system failed the fisherman and the fish?
Well, yeah, it gets down to failing the fishermen because we're powerless. The commercial fishing industry in our country, we've tried over for decades to get a unified national group together, and it never succeeds. It's hard to even do it on a state level because you got so many different fisheries. You got gill netters, you got potters, you got trawl fishermen, and you got scallopers and clammers, and they use dredges. There's so many different gear types, and you're all competing, so forth, for different aspects of the fishery. And it's just very hard to, and then you get egos involved and so forth. It's very hard to keep an organization together. Meanwhile, NGOs there, these are college educated people that work as mm, a, a whole group. They work. They're integrated in their beliefs and so forth. And you're either on the train or you're not. And if you're not, you're in a closet somewhere. I like to say in like Woods Hole there, if you don't go along with the science they want you to go along with, they're going to put you counting goldfish in a toilet bowl in a closet somewhere. Because you have to go along and do what they say and come up. Years ago, I'm going back to the 80s, and it was pretty much there. Our belief in the industry, by many of us anyway, was that the NIMS was giving the scientists a number and saying, this is what we want you to prove for summer flounder population or for the cod population. You need to prove this, okay? Just do the numbers to make it work. And the statistical analysis for stocks, it's a very, very narrow niche field. There's only one employment opportunity there for a person with that degree, and that's to work for NIMS in one of the science centers. So consequently, you do what you have to do, and you come up with. I'll give you an idea here. It was about 8 years ago. The National Academy of Sciences was tasked with reviewing a bunch of fish stocks that had been declared overfished. Okay, and they went over 100 stocks, and they located, I believe, 22 stocks of fish that were declared overfished and went through rebuilding programs, but then they later decided that they were never overfished in the first place. Consequently, hundreds of millions of dollars were lost in the fishing industry. And spiny dogfish is the best example of that. I mean, they encouraged the whole industry to get into spiny dogfish. This is another example of the New England groundfish collapse. Okay, and let me point this out here. That collapse was caused by foreign vessels. Okay, and that's why we passed the Magnuson Act and the EEZ back in 1976, 200-mile limit, to kick the foreign boats out. These boats, and I remember seeing them out there. You'd leave Point Pleasant, Manasquan Inlet there, and you were looking at a city of lights, 15 miles off our coast. Soviet factory trawlers, 300-foot long trawlers, a 600-foot long mothership, and they were just loading up the boat. The mothership gets filled, another one was there to replace it the next day. And I have said this for years, but we were basically letting the Soviet Union feed your population on the cheap so they could build nuclear weapons to shoot at us. I was like, what was the reason here? And there was, and this is when you have a fishery that was managed by about 10 different government agencies. Okay, I won't say managed, but they had a piece of it. Everybody uses the fishing industry as a poker chip in the government. Okay, and this was the State Department. Okay, you couldn't just kick out the Soviet fleet from our, well, we didn't have 200 miles yet. It was a 12-mile limit. But if you wanted to make that 200-mile limit, you couldn't just pick out one group. You had to kick everybody out. So that meant that the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Japanese, you'd have to kick them all out. And the State Department refused to do that. So consequently, they let these guys continue raping us because the industry was fighting it since the 60s, telling them what they're doing there. They started on the Georges Banks and worked their way south. My stepfather was a holder of three of the five bluefin tuna permits on the East Coast. Okay, and a very valuable fishery. But he told me there one time he had a scientist telling them there was only 700 bluefin tuna in the whole Atlantic Ocean, and Roger Hillhouse happened to be, he's the guy I'm talking about there. He happened to be the spotter pilot for his boats, one of them anyway. And he took this guy up and they counted thousands of them in just one little flight off of Virginia there. And the guy's like, whoa, I guess that's going to change the science a little bit. Because this is, these people come up with numbers out of the God knows where. But, he talks about seeing schools of mackerel going down the coast that were 40 miles long, and that's been gone since the Soviet fleet wiped them out. And this is what we lost, and we were left with the crumbs. And our fishery management councils had to figure out how to bring it back, and they did for a bit. But then you see, they encouraged too much in the '80s by giving financial incentives to pretty much anybody that wanted a tax write-off, and the doctors and lawyers started buying boats because that was a good tax write-off.
It sounds very interesting, but it sounds like a lot happened back then that eventually ended up shaping what we're living in now.
Today, yes, yes. Actually, of our fish stocks, most of them are considered recovered on the East Coast. There's very few that are really in bad shape, except cod. Cod remains a really hard fish to get a handle on. Now, you got, and it gets down to the science. I was talking about the 2022 species there that were found to be overfished, but really warrant. Cod is one of them, and you got fishermen out of Rhode Island would tell you there that like I just had a 10,000 pound tow of codfish, and gee, I had to let them all go because I'm not on a groundfish day, and there's a trip limit on them. Wouldn't allow me to do it anyway, But somehow the trawl surveys are missing these fish, so there's a lot more fish. I I made the analogy there if you were doing a population analysis of the U.S., okay, and you happen to go into the Mojave Desert and count all the people there, and well, no, there's no fish there, but I go a couple hundred miles and visit Los Angeles. They don't, you know, they they bypass their troll surveys bypass any hard bottom where the fish hang out because you're going to tear up your net. If they tear up the net, they'll never tow there again because it's costly to them because nobody on a boat knows how to mend a net. It's interesting. The troll surveys, they went from actually having real fishermen on the boats, running the boat, and knowing what he was doing to having a NOAA employee there be the captain, and you might have a fisherman who couldn't make it in the real world on the boat working for him. But they did their best to avoid fish as far as I can see. And I was involved actually in the creation of the newest trawl net that they created back after an industry member in Massachusetts discovered that they were towing their nets with the wrong lengths of towing cable. One side was shorter than the other, meaning that the net's going through the water cocked. So it's not fishing effectively. It's still fishing, but it's not fishing effectively. And if you were to try and do that on a boat that you're trying to make a living on. You'd be out of business in a few weeks because you're just, why is that guy catching 10,000 pounds of fish and I'm catching 1,000? Because your net's out of whack. Well, that led into a whole examination of the whole trawl surveys, which were the basis of stock assessments, the trawl surveys. So if you're dealing with those numbers and you don't have a net that can adequately catch the fish and sample what's out there, you're going to have bad science, and that's what they've had. It's gotten better. It's gotten better, but a lot of it, like I say, it seems like some of this stuff was political, especially 25 years ago, 25 to even 15. It's got a little better.
I just want to quickly go back to the part where you mentioned the NGOs. Now, you are absolutely spot on when you say that it's a bunch of people in a group who are all coming out graduates from colleges, universities, MBAs, legal law school, whatnot. And more often than not, especially with the ocean, you see the messaging of save, 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 save everything because everything's going to die out. Um, how detached would you say that these agendas have been in terms of manipulating the masses? Because there's never really been any science backed NGO data, has there? I mean, there's always been this, quota mismanagement, misinterpreted survey data's climate shift you had mentioned in the beginning of this podcast was never accounted for. It always seemed like these NGOs, these AROs rather, have been overreaching.
Well, I, I'm not going to mention the woman's name who was involved in the spiny dogfish issue, but she dogged the council for half a dozen years, and she was trying with her group to shut down all the fisheries on the East Coast. And they were going to use spiny dogfish to do that because we catch them as bycatch in almost every fishery. The spiny dogfish is one of the most populous big fish out in the ocean in the Atlantic there. And they using the idea that once they opened up the fishery for spiny dogfish, now this is an international market. There's not really a market for spiny dogfish in the U.S. It's fish and chips in Europe. They use it for fish and chips. That's where the product is. So these would be they got to be processed in the U.S. So we had processing plants open up from Massachusetts down to North Carolina. Okay, and there was being 60 million pounds of dogfish being caught and processed per year. Well, they virtually shut the fishery down into a bycatch. And this was all thanks to this one woman harping on the science. She's a shark person, okay? Now, spiny dogfish, they live 35 to 50 years. They gestation period of 18 months, and they'll have 6 to 12 pups born live. Survival of them is it's pretty good. There's nothing really out there that eats them. So what the science center there, they're doing trawl surveys and they're not finding these young sharks, the pups, okay, from let's say anything less than 5 years old, which is probably a 15-inch dogfish. All of these smaller dogfish in these first, well, they're not catching any because those dogfish, once they're born and they're born inshore, but then they swim offshore and they're in the deep water, 100 to 130 fathoms, and they were making like two trawl surveys along a whole 1,000-mile bank, on the edge. They just were not towing in this deep water. And that's where these dogfish were, the babies. So she convinced the science center, and then they proved it. They were showing all these numbers here. How the juvenile population was down so low. We were targeting, and this fishery targets the female dogfish gets much larger than the males. Males might only get 28 inches long, but the female could be over 3 feet long and 15 pounds. So you target the females because there wasn't much meat on the males. So consequently, they're saying we're killing all the breeding stock, and you are. It's not good target the breed and stock of any species. But when you got the most popular species on the East Coast and it's there and it can withstand that pressure, I don't see the problem. So anyway, uh, they shut the fishery down. A fishery director from Massachusetts worked out a deal where in state waters he could keep his fishermen working. Okay, so there was a 6 million kind of bycatch quota. I believe it was about that, and that kept that fishery alive. It kept at least one processor in business, but probably half a dozen went out of business, and they never came back. They'd never come back. So you got a substantial industry just ruined by bad science. Well, anyway, after they started doing surveys in the deep, all of a sudden, they went and back. I'm a council member. I fought vociferously, and it's probably the main reason why I wasn't reappointed. They didn't like me disputing their science. But hey, I'm out there. I see it. You don't. God forbid. So they went. Their projections were that if they didn't do anything, just stop fishing, maybe the stock would recover by 2035. And this is going back to 2002. If they kept fishing at a minimal rate, I mean, they're literally saying in there that the stock could be extinct by 2035. They're literally saying that these fish are going to disappear and be gone. And surprisingly, in 2008, they declared the stock totally rebuilt. Now that's a rebuilding plan that should have took 10 years. And, it wasn't that they rebuilt, the population was the same. They were using numbers. It's interesting, but you can, because I actually requested the Landon's data, okay, back from the first stock assessment, okay, back in 1960 or so. And I found there that the amount of dogfish in the ocean in 1960 was the same as it was when they said it was in dire straits and they were going to go extinct. The biomass was estimated at the same, I don't know, 46 million tons, or something in that area there. Just the population was skewed a little bit more later on because there would have been more males than females. But the point is that there were plenty of dogfish out there. They were estimating 250 million tons, I believe, of biomass. And those fish have to eat everything. And this was the main thing that was stopping all of our fish stocks from recovering is you got a big predator out there that you're protecting, and he is eating every day. Now, we got a scientist from Woods Hole, and he was on record. He's telling the council there that spiny dogfish only eat jellyfish. It's like 90% of his diet is jellyfish. It's like, geez. I went out on one of the. I was out on a troll survey boat 2 times, and the one time I'm cutting open a dogfish there, I pull out a 10-inch summer flounder out of the belly, and it show it to the scientist next to me there, and said, this doesn't look like a jellyfish to me. And this is they eat anything in their way. Henry Bigelow, the U.S.'s top marine scientist 100 years ago, their troll survey vessels named after him, said they're the most voracious predator in the ocean. They will eat any and everything. And here you got a government scientist say, oh no, they only eat jellyfish. I wish they did because there's a lot of jellyfish out there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, but that's what it is, isn't it, Jim? The fact that behind the scenes there has always been this manipulation of data towards the masses, and the masses are, I mean, they're also our listeners, but they are gullible when it comes to animals, when it comes to wildlife. It's very easy to emotionally manipulate somebody and make them believe something that isn't true you know and we've seen this across different species. If we move away from fish, we can look at lions, we can look at giraffes, we can look at the tiger in India, we can look at perhaps every species has gone through this phase of manipulation of data, which just seems absolutely crazy to me. I mean, they really did their job well. I give that to them, but the fact that there was never no science involved, the fact that there was never actual on ground boots involved, it was just people sitting in boardrooms deciding the next move for the next decade.
Yeah, yeah. In this case, like I say, this was oil driven. Okay, because Pew Charitable Trust was founded by Joseph Pew, the creator of Sunoco Oil. So there's your tie. He founded in 1990. He founded Oceana. He didn't, but Pew Charitable Trust did. They founded Oceana to do a huge. They did like a 3,000 page study on the possible damaging effects of everything that could possibly affect the ocean. Okay, you name it, it's in there. Surprisingly, there's only about 2 pages in the whole report about oil drilling and oil spills. I swear to God, I swear to God, nothing. It's like that has no effect whatsoever. So here now, I, when about 5 years ago, they started doing preliminary research for windmills after Joe Biden got elected president and they passed the Green New Deal. That allowed the windmill companies to come in with their research vessels and blast the shit out of the excuse me blast the hell out of the ocean bottom with seismic apparatuses. They weren't using seismic air gun arrays that the oil companies use, which are 240 dBs, which is a different dBs than on land. Sound is measured differently, okay, and there's a different thing. It's just easier to say dBs, you know. Um, but so instead of 240 dBs, they're using equipment that's at 210, and whales will suffer damage at about 180 if they're in the vicinity, depending on how close they are. So they got a fleet of about 10 of these boats between Virginia and Massachusetts, and the sound's traveling hundreds of miles, crisscrossing everything, and you end up with, over the course of 4 years, like 200 dead large whales. God knows how many thousands of dolphins, marine mammals, just, a massacre. It's a marine mammal massacre. And coincidentally, it's happening wherever these boats are, you know, and it hadn't taken place before. And they're saying there's no correlation between the seismic, and sonar that they're using there and the whales washing up on the beach. It's just, maybe it's a bacteria, who knows, but it has nothing to do with us. It's ship strikes. It's the fishing industry. Always it's the fishing industry all the time whenever something happens. Um, pretty sad state of affairs, but I your listeners should read into some articles I wrote. They were in FisheryNation.com. It's a website. A friend of mine had it. And I wrote a series of articles once this started happening. So I had retired, but to see this happening to these whales and knowing what was causing it, and seeing the government fighting against that, the National Marine Fisheries Service, you name it, they're all saying no, it has no correlation there. And they coincidentally never wanted to do any science about the effects of this sound because they know, like what that would find. The NRDC, National Resources Defense Council, had spent 10 years suing the U.S. Navy over sonar, okay, because they started being documented there. Hey, like these 20 whales that washed up on the beach over here, there happened to be a couple naval vessels doing war games or whatever you want to say. And whenever these were happening, whales and dolphins were washing up dead. So they did prove this correlation between the sound and the marine mammals' deaths, but amazingly, all of these environmental groups, because this was for wind, the green energy, ignored it. They stuck their head in the sand and watched as hundreds of whales died, including the critically endangered northern right whale. There's about 350 left in the ocean there. So these are all dying, and no relation to this, and even worse is when they're building the windmills, pile driving. That's the loudest noise in the ocean. highest decibel level. Might as well blow off a nuclear weapon there, and that's what you got every 8 to 10 seconds. This huge hammer comes down, pile driving the columns into the seabed. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But this article I'm talking about, I combined them all into one on Fishery Nation. It's called "Of Wind and Whales," and if you search that, you can read that, and it's very informative. And unfortunately, a lot of it was not readily available because of internet censorship. People didn't want you to read this information. So we watched the shares on Facebook all of a sudden just stop. It's like, what happened? Yeah, I got hundreds of shares here, and all of a sudden, like nothing.
Well, to our listeners specifically, I'll take in a second that we will definitely be linking in the articles on this podcast and on our YouTube channel, so you can have a direct link to them. And I just want to go back to something that I know you've said before, Jim. You've mentioned how bad policy hurts fish more than good fishermen ever could. This is something you've said, and I think in what you just described, it perfectly explains that, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I'm going to give you a really good example of bad policy, and this was driven by NGOs, okay, and if you want to get into how much they infiltrated fishery management, they created the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Sustainable Fisheries Act, I believe 1997, and that was like when the Greenies got a hold of the Magnuson Act and wrote it their way, and all of a sudden you had to rebuild stocks in 10 years, and you know put a whole bunch of restraints on the industry. Well, some fish you can't rebuild in 10 years because they live a long time and they take a long time to grow. Some fish like squid, Eel-Ex Go squid, they're still not sure how long the life of an eel-like squid is. Is it 9 months? Is it 18 months? And there's various scenarios there. They just don't know. Um, they do know that they get affected by loud noises, though. It affects their inner balance there. And there's been giant squid washed up in Spain about 20 years ago when there was some offshore seismic air guns. So it's interesting. But one of the things they did was say that bycatch is bad. Okay, and the bycatch is when you're especially with but you get it in gill nets too, but trawl nets, you're towing a net and you open in the sweep area. Now I'm dealing with a 75 foot vessel, mine, and the sweep area of that net, it's going to catch fish in an area, let's say 30 or 40 feet wide. Maybe a little more with the ground cables might herd some more into it, but it's not a big area that is covering. It's not clear cut in the ocean like they're claiming, okay? Because most of the fishing is done in sand and mud, okay? So a northeaster moves more sand and mud around than our nets do. Well, anyway, you're going to catch, if we're catching, let's say we're catching white and we're going to come up with some skates, you're going to catch some dogfish, and you're going to catch some of the stuff's not marketable, some of the stuff's undersized, and you can't bring it in. There's no market for it. Years ago now, back in the 50s, you could bring that stuff in and it'd go to a fish meal processing plant and they'd make it into fertilizer or livestock feed. But the NIMBYs didn't want those processing plants in their backyard because they smelled. So they all closed down. That took place over the course of decades or so. But yeah, so there's none of that. So this stuff just became bycatch that wasn't utilized. And it was basically an unfulfilled life of these animals. But the thing is, if you're going to manage fish and you're going to say, we're only going to target this one fish and I'm going to design gear that's only catch that one fish, that means that everything else in the ocean you're leaving out there, which may not be a good thing because maybe you're leaving a lot of dogfish out there because that's what happened. That population of dogfish from 1960 to 1990 quadrupled from 50 million to 200 million. Okay. And this is a voracious predator. They filled the niche that was left when the cod and haddock and the mackerel and the whiting were wiped out. Okay. So consequently, with all of these dogfish out there, you're not going to recover any of those stocks because you got a big what do you got, non-productive consumer out there. Okay, he's not doing any benefit to anybody unless well, he's doing benefit to his own species, but he's throwing everything else out of whack. So it's what they call a chaos ecosystem. Okay, and that's what the ocean is. It's a chaos. You never know what's going to happen one way to the other. Um, you could have a great year class of cod on the Georges banks, and if you get the right kind of temperature inversion on the Georges banks and mackerel move in there, they eat all the larvae up, and all of a sudden a good year class went to a nothing. So there's just so many variables in the ocean. Like you say, chaos is the best way to explain it. Chaos ecosystem. But the thing is, there, if you are catching all of these different species of fish, then you need to catch them in proportion to what you're keeping. Okay, when you throw that dead fish overboard, something else is eating it. Okay, whether it's a seagull or it's a bluefish swimming in the water, as that fish sinks, something's going to eat it, even down to a crab. And at the bottom of the, benthic organisms on the bottom, something eats it. It doesn't rot away to nothing. So it's still performing its task of creating this circle in the ecosystem of birth, living, dying, being eaten, however that is. But there's a circle there.
Yeah, yeah, and that circle actually gets transferred to what the basis of our podcast is. We're heading into the COP20. It's just a few days away now, just less than 10 days away. And this is actually where your experience becomes vital. Many marine species are being proposed for CITES listings: sharks, rays, eels, and more often than not, with quite flimsy or incomplete science. From your perspective, what really happens when an organization like CITES lists for CITES get made without this proper data? What happens to the markets collapsing, or what the legal fisheries and the illegal trade?
Well, it's exactly what happens is the industry collapses there. They tried to list spiny dogfish. This woman tried to get them listed as an endangered species there, and then they pressured Europe into listing it, or like it's threatened, or however they did it there. So marketing, they killed our marketing for these fish for a while. I don't know whether we've got it back or not, but the end result is that you could put fishermen out of business for bad science with bad politics. By bad politics. It's just we need to eat. People need to eat. Whether we're more endangered than the fish are at this point. Fishermen. I don't see much future for the industry. I'm glad I grew up when I did because I just don't see much happening there. It seems that there's going to be further consolidation of the U.S. fleet, and it just doesn't look good.
What's crazy to me, Jim, is that policies which are made in conference halls, spending millions and millions of dollars in different countries, thousands of miles away, are destroying coastal communities in literally hours, because something gets passed at CITES, something like for the sharks or something for the eels or rays or any kind of fish, and boom, like the effect on the fishermen is immediate.
Well, it's interesting, but the CITES is very much like a bureaucracy, okay? In that the one thing they want to do is they want to always look like they're doing something. And at some point, after you get by the few species that you really had a concern about, ivory trade and so forth, at some point, then you start nitpicking and finding stuff there that's really of little relevance. But it can have a severe impact on people, especially indigenous people there that are relying on it, that don't have access to major markets or anything, but they rely on it for subsistence. I love marine mammals, but there's a ton of pilot whales out there. There's literally schools. I don't know what pods of them, but we'd be out fishing, and I swear we're fishing in the Hudson Canyon in the spring, and the whales are migrating by at that time. And when we would haul back our net, okay, the boat slows down and the power takeoff goes in gear. It creates a different sound. And you could watch pods of pilot whales actually from a mile away kind of charge your boat because they know that you're going to bring your net up and these fish are going to be coming out, spilling out of it, and they get a free meal. They're pretty intelligent, but there's no shortage of them. There are shortage of a lot of large whales. I mean, we really need to be careful. We got to share the world. You know, but there are populations, Iceland for one. Where they depend on whales. For food. So
which was also looked down upon by the NGOs, and and more often than not, especially this year. I mean, I've been going through the fisheries proposals at CITES upcoming COP, and to put it politely, it seems like a buffet of political theater sort of disguised as sustainability. We've got the sharks and rays, which are of course a long time NGO fundraising favorite. We've got the sea cucumbers, who suddenly became a national security threat, um, which is absurd to me. We've got the eels, who have more proposals than actual data on them. We've got the abalone, a South African listing framed as sustainable use, and even the American ginseng slices somehow mixed into the aquatic chaos, as you said. So if we were to just briefly break these down, Jim, especially starting with the sharks and rays, they're in the appendix 2 by default, right? And the usual suspects, as I like to call them. There are multiple proposals to slap them into appendix 2 as a just in case. What would you say is the danger of this precautionary listing mentality?
well, it closes markets. Okay, so if there's a marketable fishery there for those species, and you listed with it, CITES two there, you're going to close that market down. Whether it's directly or indirectly, it'll be closed down. Buyers, you won't have buyers for it. You know, and that could have a ripple effect down. If it you see if you got a port that depends on one particular fish, and you cut that down, well, not only might the boats and the dock go out of business or the docks, but the infrastructure around it, the welders and mechanics, the electronics guys, the net builders, so forth. But that's all part of the infrastructure, and they all disappear. And we've seen that in Point Pleasant. There, we've lost our boatyard. We've lost our welding shop that we had for years. We have one left. We lost our all of the mechanics. They're gone. We don't have an electronics guy. They're all gone. They're all victims of fishery management.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, it's like, if it swims, list it, and if it looks like a shark, just double list it. You know, and similarly for the cucumbers, who I sort of I've started terming them as perhaps the most politicized slug in the ocean. We have we have proposals calling them a trafficking and organized crime threat. And in the US, we have a push for a global workshop and multiple suggestions for appendix 2 listings. In your experience, Jim, is this science, or is this just a storyline? Because it's so much patchy data and misleading, scary fear narratives.
You know what? See now, in the U.S., we're guided by the usage of best available science. So if there isn't much science, that's the best there is. And they can interpret that any way they want to. So if an NGO gets in there, like they did with the spiny dogfish, they can say that, hey, look at all of the babies are gone and you're killing all the mothers. The stock's going to go extinct, you know? And you can manipulate that and use it to your advantage. And if you have an administration there that is looking for ways to put fishermen out of business, because see, the National Marine Fishery Service is located in the Commerce Department. We're not in the Agriculture Department or Fish and Wildlife. We're in the Commerce Department. Okay, this is the poker chips I was talking about earlier. State Department, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife Service, you name it. And it's our parent agency is NOAA, National Oceans and yeah, Atmospheric Administration, but they're part of the Commerce Department too, and they shouldn't be there. It should be separate, and that's the politics that get involved there. You would have fisheries traded for something else that's more important to them. It just becomes a trading game.
Yeah, and these oversimplified bans more often than not end up creating black markets. You know, it just so happens that and I'm 30 years old. I'm still quite young, I would say, but I have seen sea cucumbers becoming they used to be seafood, and now they're national security threats. And it just makes me think, what's next? Like mussels becoming weapons of mass destruction. What exactly is it with eels? Similarly as well, we're listing them without a plan. We have several species proposed for listing, but every article I read and every scientist and every experienced fisherman like you who I speak to, they all say the same thing, that we don't even know enough about eel life cycles to manage them at a global level. It's like we're listing a species we literally don't understand. What could go wrong there?
Exactly. Tell that to the processors, the dogfish processors that went out of business there. Like you say, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars lost in these fisheries here that they closed down for bad science. And worse is, like you say, when it's politicized science.
Would you say, Jim, that CITES has unfortunately, in its modern avatar, become a conservation treaty, or more of a political theater company? Because I often get that feeling from it.
Uh, I was at the 2019 CITES there, and that was definitely my impression there. Was it was very politicized at that point there, and the chips were stacked against proper conservation. Where humans can still utilize something. It's either all or nothing to an environmentalist. It's all or nothing. And they prefer nothing. And I think they want you eating rocks. Personally, I've said that for years. There, what are we supposed to eat? If it has eyes, you can't eat it. Well, plants have feelings too. I mean, where's it end?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's even difficult to understand where did it start. So where does it end is perhaps a very, very legitimate question. And the more species we look at that are being listed in the CITES, the more complicated the story gets. It just keeps getting more and more complicated with each and every species. If I have to talk, like I mentioned, the abalone, it's perhaps the only one proposal that actually makes sense, perhaps because there is a favor of sustainable use with the goal of enabling controlled trade and rebuilding populations. So perhaps that is the only one proposal that I see, that, oh, okay, it's a proposal from CITES for what it was intended: regulated, sustainable, legal trade. Perhaps the abalone model could be a model for marine use done right. um, am I right there?
Well, I'm not familiar with what they've done with the abalone there, but definitely, somewhere they're doing things right, and in some they're totally wrong, and you need to be able to figure out what works. Okay, be inclusive, and what works for one species may not work for another. So uh, it's a feeling out period. Let's say with fishery management in the U.S., you started from scratch, and they built from the ground up. And they made mistakes, and they've been corrected over the years. I think that the system runs a lot better than it did, but there's once again the politicization of certain people that want to own it all. Okay, and through limited access. However, they just end up weeding things out, like through the ITQ process they did with surf clams. until you only have X amount. We've said for years. I go back 40 years. Some friends of mine there, we talk, and like it's pretty clear what the government wants. They don't want 2,000 boats out there. They want 20. They want 20, 150, 200-foot boats that they can keep track of and know what they're doing. And hell with the thousands of people that are going to be put out of business.
I want to take an opportunity to bring India into this, because that's kind of where our work connects. In India, we've got small scale fishers, and they are the backbone of coastal livelihoods, and pretty much uh, uh, three-fourths of our country is coastal. And when I say small scale fishers are the backbone of coastal livelihoods, I think that's just like it is in New Jersey. We've seen, both of us in New Jersey and in India, or rather the US and in India, we've seen these similar patterns. These top-down bans, the lack of consultation, the very high impact of foreign NGO slash animal rights organizations' influence, and the most important part to me, which is local expertise being ignored. This is something we've seen in India. So, do you see a global pattern here by the NGO playbook?
Sure looks like it, because they've pretty much, people like me, they didn't want on the council because I was too outspoken. The Fishery Management Council. God forbid you should have somebody, pointing out actual facts and going through some science that may not be good or accurate, because I can smell bad science if that's a fishery I'm involved in, and they're telling me, like that. That's not what I'm seeing, and they come up with all these. You know what? I got a PhD. I know more than you, because I read these numbers in a book. And hey, once I went out on a troll survey vessel. But yeah, that's the expertise you're dealing with. It's fantasy land. It's fantasy land. We're gonna estimate the fish population because we caught 12 fish here in this tow. Okay, so now if that tow was a mile long, if we extrapolate that, we're gonna have X amount of fish on the whole coast. It doesn't work that way. Doesn't they? Here's how management used to work before management, and it was the most successful management. Okay, one, you got to understand, it's almost impossible to fish a fish commercially to extinction. Okay, because you reach a point where the cost exceeds the gains, the profit. Okay, so as you're and a price rise is only going to cover so much. As a fish gets scarcer, the price will go up if it's a good marketable fish. But at some point, it can only go so far. So what you got then is what we used to do. Let's say whiting. We had to find something else to do, and we had the ability to do that because we had a mixed trawl fishery in the Mid Atlantic. We didn't have, like, New England had fish that were there year round. We had migratory fish in the Mid Atlantic, that they were here in the spring and the fall, but maybe not in the summer or whatever. New England fish would come down as the water got colder in the wintertime. We'd see cod and haddock. Here's an interesting. Um, we landed 3.5 million pounds of cod in 1960 in New Jersey. Today we land zero. Yeah, zero. So that's global warming. That's the Soviet fleet wiping us out, and that's the fact that they've never recovered. And some of that has to do with the ecosystem, the chaos, and having a large predator like dogfish out there running around eating everything. There's so much involved. You can't point your finger at any one thing.
Well, how do we build a world where fishermen, not NGOs, are guiding sustainable use? Because without that world, this is exactly the consequence, isn't it? Losing the cord completely.
Yeah. Well, I suggested this over 20 years ago, the creation of an expert fisherman advisory panel that would review the spring and the Woods Hole does two surveys a year for finfish, the spring and the fall survey, which is the wrong time of the year to do it. Okay, right off the bat, but they've been doing it since 1960 or so, so we can't change that. Well, the thing is, there, if you do it in the spring and the fall, what you catch may differentiate year to year because of temperature. You know, if you got, you know, it's a late winter or it's an early spring or something that affects when the fish could migrate by a month. So if you're here one year, you know, and it's been warm all winter, you're not going to see the same fish at that time that you would if you had a cooler winter. It's a variable. You need in the summer and the winter when these fish are in these positions where they're going to be, they're not migrating. You got to get the fish when they're at home, basically, you know, not when they're traveling. So they've set the troll surveys up at the wrong time of the year, and they because they've been doing it so long, they can't change it according to them. Um, but what you need to do is here they come up with the numbers of what they're catching, and my idea was to have a panel of 6 to 12 expert fishermen, and that could include some party boat guys there, you know, recreational guys hook and line. They see certain fish that we don't, you know, and the catch rates of them. So if you had this expert panel meet and review the data that they come up with from these trawl surveys, and maybe, you know, hey, I can tell you why this happened, you know, from a person who's got 20, 30, 40 years of experience on the water of catching those fish. This is what you need to do. That needs to be integrated into the system. But the scientists do not want fishermen to have a voice in this. You know, it's just, you know, like you're a token Indian kind of. No, I mean American Indian. That's a terminology here, but you know, it's just yeah, it's pretty sad. They've had opportunities to increase it there, and they don't want to give fishermen the voice they need or the respect that they need for their observations, because there are people out here, you know, they want to, you know, the villainization once again there. We can't trust what you say because you're just looking to profit from it. No, if I catch all those fish out there, I'm out of business. Okay, we are the conservationists, and while we're doing that, we're feeding people. I don't see farmers aren't villainized. Why are fishermen?
Yep, yep. Absolutely, Jim. Absolutely. Um, as we come to the end tail of the podcast, I'm I mean, I got chills when you said we are the conservationists because this is exactly the narrative that's been lost. You know, people have been fed the bullshit that fishermen are the villains, where we started from. And we end the podcast with one very strong statement by you that fishermen are the conservationists. You know, and this bullshit narrative by the AROs for purely commercial purposes has led to the absolute demise of so many species, the demise of the idea of sustainable fisheries, the collapse of entire markets and trade systems, and most of all livelihoods, you know, which angers me as a modern day conservationist, you know. And it's about time we bring in changes that start reversing the situation in the right direction, you know. Which brings me to one of my very important questions, towards the end tail of the podcast, that if you, Mr. Jim Lovren, could stand on the COP20 floor in the coming days in Samarkand and tell delegates one thing about marine species bans, what would it be?
Uh, well, the most important thing there, if they want to do that, have accurate science. If they don't have accurate science, they shouldn't be doing something. Don't, you know, it's the precautionary principle to the extreme. We found in the U.S. fisheries there that they were using the precautionary principle at every level of a stock assessment there, you know. So before you know it, you had the precautionary principle on top of the precautionary principle, you know, and that's what leads to these bans because, well, we don't know, so we got to be extra careful. You know what? It's a big ocean out there. You cannot catch every fish in the ocean. You cannot kill every, well, you can kill every fish in the ocean environmentally, but we're not gonna do it fishing by fishing, plain and simple. And end result is we all have to eat, and like it or not, animals are food.
Right. So, with that, Jim, I'm going to move on to the closing. Um, and I mean, before I close the whole podcast, I just want to say to you that this has been an absolute eye opener for me as well, because I think the AROs, the Greenies, made a very conscious effort of making sure that especially the urban elites and the privileged class gets detached from these realities,
Hmm.
and because then it's very easy to villainize somebody. Then it's very easy to say, hey, this guy, he's crazy. He overfishes. Nobody talks about overregulation. Everybody starts talking about overfishing. You know,
Yeah.
and I think that's a very sad reality. And to the listeners, I just want to say before I close the podcast that I hope you are able to absorb this alternative reality that exists. If anything, this is not even an alternative reality. This is the reality, and what you've been fed is an alternative storyline. So I hope you're able to absorb from what Jim has to share from us. And here's what Mr. Jim Lovgren reminds us: the fact that fish don't need slogans, they need science. And coastal communities need respect, not restrictions made half a world away. So as we head into the COP20 in just a few days, I think it's important for all of us to remember that bans do not rebuild ecosystems. Partnerships do, local knowledge does, and sustainable use, real data driven, community driven, always performs, rather outperforms emotional politics. So, Jim, thank you for bringing decades of hard earned wisdom to our podcast, Use It or Lose It. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to have this chat with you.
Thank you. I appreciate your having me on. It's been very, very good, and I appreciate it. I'd like to get those views across.
I hope so. I hope we can get the reality across to the people who matter, and bring about a positive change.